Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-Jung Cho. President Yoon Suk-yeol hosts Japanese and Chinese leaders in Seoul for the first trilateral summit in more than 4 years. The North Korean leader's sister denied arms exports to Russia, saying the weapons were intended for use against Seoul. Today we discuss how South Korea and Japan can manage their relationship with China and how best to respond to threats from North Korea.
삼국 국민들이 혜택을 체감할 수 있는 미래지향적이고 실질적인 협력의 모멘텀을 확보하는 계기가 될 것입니다.
China has had a long-term relationship with North Korea, and you don't want a third wheel.
In the studio with me, Mr. Bruce Klingner, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Klingner spent 20 years at the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency and served as CIA's Deputy Division Chief for Korea. Also joining us, Dr. Sung-Yoon Lee, Fellow at the 윌슨센터. Dr. Lee was previously Professor of Korean Studies at the Fletcher School of Tufts University. Dr. Lee authored The Sister, North Korea's Kim-Yo정, the Most Dangerous Woman in the World. Welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you for having us.
Now, Mr. Klingner, the leaders of South Korea, Japan, and China are meeting in Seoul after a long hiatus amid intensifying U.S.-China competition and hardening global fault lines. What is the significance of the latest meeting?
Well, first of all, the fact that it's taking place after a 4.5-year hiatus, and that was in part due to COVID, but also strained relations amongst the three countries, including South Korea and Japan. So the fact that there's a resolution enough degree that the leaders can get together. So ostensibly, they're going to be talking mostly about economic issues, development, science and technology. But clearly, I think below the waves, there will be discussion on security issues such as North Korea, as well as China's vision of what it would want the Indo-Pacific region to be, very China-centric. And they will be very critical of rapprochement between South Korea and Japan, as well as the resumption of military exercises between them, as well as in line with the United States.
As Mr. Klingner just mentioned, the rapprochement between South Korea and Japan after some 5 years of something bordering on enmity between the two nations is a development that is concerning to China and perhaps also to Russia, because the reinforcement of the loose trilateral, not a formal, but trilateral alliance system led by the United States is a growing security concern to the Chinese and the Russians and the North Koreans. So China today has a strong incentive to reach out to Japan and South Korea and express its position, its national interests.
Mm-hmm. Specifically on economic cooperation, it is expected that the three leaders will agree on promoting free and fair trade and also strengthening supply chain of the raw materials. And U.S.'s idea of supply chain resiliency is to reduce dependency on China. Then how can South Korea and Japan pursue supply chain cooperation with the United States and China at the same time? And when it comes to free trade, do you think semiconductor items would be excluded because South Korea and Japan only have small room to import Chinese semiconductors, only legacy chips?
The Biden administration, as you know, has been putting pressure on both South Korea and Japan and even the Netherlands, another major producer of semiconductors, to move away from dependence on the China market. It's a very thorny issue for the current Yoon Suk-yeol administration, I think just this week, President Yoon himself declared that the government, South Korean government, would invest almost $20 billion to support South Korean firms that produce semiconductors. There is a semiconductor company, a South Korean company, SK Hynix in Dalian in northeastern China, that's sort of in limbo because of the intense pressure by the United States on South Korea to curtail its dependence on the Chinese market. So it's a conundrum, I understand, for Japanese, for South Koreans and others perhaps. But again, when it comes to national security, South Korea's sole treaty ally is the United States. So one has to be diplomatic, but I think South Korea is now gearing up to inch away from China in gradual steps, of course, not all at once, and be in compliance more with the US position.
Mr. Klingner, Korea, Japan, and China are expected to be sharply divided on security issues, and China's priority is regional stability. How do you think China will view North Korea lessening its dependence on China and accelerating its nuclear and missile development with the help of Russia?
China has been relatively quiet about the growing relationship between Moscow and Pyongyang, and they don't want to be too closely aligned with having it be a trilateral alliance, because both North Korea and Russia can take actions which would invoke international response, and China doesn't want to be a part of that. So I think they're being quiet, and they just want to maintain or improve their relations with North Korea and Russia, but on a separate track. So it's sort of not a trilateral alliance, but really a series of bilateral relationships.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Klingner, is there a red line in Japan, South Korea, China cooperation that, if crossed, could hurt U.S. interests?
Well, we can sort of think of extreme examples. If South Korea and Japan were to announce they were canceling military exercises in response to a Beijing request, or that they were sort of abandoning the ongoing trend of economic diversification away from China and towards the other democracies. Or we could come up with other less extreme red lines. But in Washington, there's much less concern that either leader will do something that is against U.S. interests. Under the Moon Jae-in administration, there would have been much more concern that he would do something that would not be in U.S. interests, or that would work against the relationship with Washington or the alliance with Washington. So there's much less concern, really no concern, I think, in Washington about what might happen at this summit. Certainly there's going to be a lot of trilateral or bilateral meetings amongst the allies, both before and after. But there's really not the concern that either Yoon or Kishida will kind of go off the farm or go off agenda.
During the Moon Jae-in administration, Korean officials said that China is a strategic partner, and that brought about fierce debate and criticism from Washington. Do you think China can be a strategic partner to South Korea?
Well, Korea and Japan and others all point to that their biggest trading partner is China, and that they can't just abandon it or sever all economic relations. I think in recent years, Japan, Australia, and others have been more direct in their criticism of Beijing, whereas South Korea has continued to sort of criticize Chinese actions, but without naming Beijing as the perpetrator. So China will try to intimidate South Korea and Japan to fall in line with Beijing's requests. And it depends on, what's uncertain is how ham-handed or heavy-fisted they will be in those threats or those coercion. They can either try to do it more benevolently and pointing out economic deals that could benefit South Korea and Japan, or introduce new economic initiatives or offers, or they, particularly behind closed doors, can be much more coercive, much more direct, but much more threatening.
Now I want to turn to South-North relations. I want both your opinion on this. President Moon Jae-in, in his memoir, said during his 2018 summit with Kim Kim reiterated that he has no intention to use nuclear weapons. In response, Unification Minister Kim Yong-ho said ignoring North Korea's missile and nuclear capabilities and focusing solely on its intentions would lead to making incorrect judgments. Now, as the U.S. continues to maintain North Korea's denuclearization as a goal, Dr. Lee, what is the key takeaway as we look ahead into future interactions with North Korea?
Well, North Korea has invested more than half a century in building the bomb. And for most of that 50-year period, North Korea maintained that it did not have a nuclear weapons program until declaring all of a sudden, right in the middle of China's Lunar New Year celebrations in February 2005, hello, we are a nuclear weapons possessing state. And intermittently, of course, over the years, North Korea has engaged other countries, including the US and South Korea, in so-called denuclearization talks. Of the 9 nuclear states in the world, North Korea stands out as the only country that has dangled before the international community the possibility of denuclearization. So when we hear Kim Jong-un tell the South Korean president, as he did a few years ago, that I want to leave a nuclear-free Korean peninsula for my children, it sounds quite touching, but I think we need to question the veracity, the sincerity in that statement. His father, Kim Jong-il, said basically the same thing. It was my dying father's last wish that we be free of nuclear weapons in the Korean peninsula. Well, that goal in part was achieved because the United States and South Korea agreed to remove all US tactical nuclear weapons from South Korea in 1991, whereas North Korea has gone in the other direction.
I think President Moon's assertions of what North Korea said or indicated that their policies are in direct contradiction to decades of facts. I mean, I think they're really naive thoughts. North Korea has been saying for decades that it has nuclear weapons, that it will use them preemptively, including against countries aligned with the United States. They have announced in 1997 and other years that they conducted missile launches that were simulated nuclear airburst attacks on South Korean ports, airfields, and command centers. So to think that North Korea wasn't going to use nuclear weapons against South Korea really it goes against all the decades of North Korean statements. I think it was back in 1994 when Pyongyang said that they would turn South Korea or Seoul into a sea of fire, obviously with nuclear weapons. So North Korea has these weapons for military capabilities. And when people have debated whether they were solely for defense and deterrence, there were statements for years of North Korea saying they were also for offensive deterrence purposes or offensive preemptive attacks.
So, Mr. Klingner, President Moon Jae-in's such views, and that was the time when there were negotiations between Pyongyang and Washington. Do you think President Moon's views added to difficulties for the U.S. officials in negotiating with North Korea?
I think the Moon administration officials overpromised what North Korea was willing to do. In March of 2018, they provided briefings to the Trump White House saying that North Korea was going to denuclearize. I think that was overstating the case, whether that was a belief that North Korea was willing to do that or they oversold it in order to prevent a war that looked like it was impending. Also, I think they probably told the North Koreans that they could deliver the Trump administration on sanctions relief and other issues that the Trump administration wasn't going to do. So I think by being in the middle, they were trying to overpromise to both sides, and I think both sides realized that was the case.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Lee, recently, North Korea said it is DPRK-ROK relationship, 조한 관계, instead of North-South relationship. And since the end of last year, North Korea referred to South Korea as puppet ROK. Such language may signal that North Korea is solidifying its perception that South and North are two hostile states. How does such a perception increase the possibility of military conflict or raise the level of escalation?
I see all the talk of South Korea as now the biggest principal enemy state to the North as an escalation in North Korea's well-honed game of psychological manipulation. It's political warfare. It doesn't fundamentally change the basic dynamic in the Korean peninsula, where you have two states, each claiming to be the sole legitimate state governing the entire Korean peninsula and its adjacent islands, and North Korea's supreme national task, as it's stipulated in the North Korean constitution, of effecting reunification of the Korean peninsula. we don't presume that to mean being absorbed by the richer, the more legitimate Korean state south of the border. We take that to mean incorporating South Korean territory and the people within the democratic or the despotic People's Republic of Korea. So when Kim Jong-un says such things, that we don't see South Korea as an agreeable partner for reunification, but as an enemy state, it creates concern, growing concern in the South Korean public, the South Korean government. It raises the stakes because North Korea is such an unconventional, such a different kind of state. The way it enhances its net value is by exporting insecurity, exporting threats. And then we go through cycles of appeasement, or diplomacy. And North Korea has gained over the past 3 decades at least $20 billion worth of blandishments from South Korea, the United States, China, and Japan and other countries. All for what? For repeated pledges, untruthful pledges of denuclearization. So this game has been a very good business model for the despotic regime.
Dr. Lee, the subtitle of your world-renowned book, now translated into 11 languages, including Ukrainian, is Kim-Young, the sister, the most dangerous woman in the world. Is there a bit of an exaggeration there? And what power does she have within the North Korean regime, do you think?
I'm very much prone to hyperbole and over-dramatization in my rhetoric, but I do see Kim Yo-jong as the most powerful woman in the world, the most dangerous woman in the world, because she has repeatedly told the world that she has, if you will, her finger on the nuclear button. In a formal statement in early April 2022, she said if South Korea launches even a conventional missile strike against North Korea, then she will, quote, unleash her nation's nuclear force on South Korea and bring about something close to total ruin and destruction on the South Korean military. So Kim Yo-jong has issued almost 50 statements since the onset of COVID in early 2020. And in some of them, she emphasizes that she's not just a young, pretty face. She has real power, and her authority and power are derived from, as she put it, comrade chairman Kim Jong-un, the party, and the state. And in a particularly rude statement in mid-June 2020, she threatened to blow up the joint North-South liaison office that was built entirely with South Korean funds, and 3 days later demolished it was. So she's to be taken very seriously.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Lee, what are the unique challenges that Kim Yo-jong faces as she climbs up the ladder in the extremely patriarchal North Korean regime? And has she lost some power since the rise of Kim Joo-ae, her niece?
I don't think so. You know, a simplistic way of seeing Kim Jong-un's frequent showcasing of his prepubescent, young, cute daughter is that there must be some tension between Kim Jong-un's wife and Kim Jong-un's sister. Now, relations between sisters-in-law in a conventional, ordinary family can be a bit complicated, but North Korea is not a conventional family. It's a medieval-style absolute monarchy where the king is infallible, semi-sacred. The king cannot be challenged even by his wife. We saw this with Chairman Mao too, Mao Zedong, a nominal communist leader, but he had concubines, he slept with young women almost every day. Even his most powerful wife, his fourth wife, Jiang Qing, couldn't do anything about her husband's philandering ways. So I see the frequent showing of the daughter as the work of the propagandist queen, which is her auntie, Kim Yo-jong, because it only favors North Korea. If it were a boy, if Kim Jong-un had a son and he was doing it, showing his son around, then I think the response by the media and by governments would be less favorable or more critical. But in showcasing the cute daughter, it creates a wholesome family ensemble dynamic. It softens up Kim Jong-un's image. It sends a message to Washington, hey, we are a dynasty, we have all the time in the world. And my power and nukes will be handed over down to the next generation.
Now, Mr. Klingner, how did Kim Yo-jong's role impact North Korea's foreign policy, especially with South Korea and the United States? And as a senior official of the Propaganda and Agitation Department, has she been effective in shaping the international society's perception of North Korea and the regime?
Well, she certainly is much more vocal, using her own authority rather than a minister of foreign affairs who would be sort of carrying out party statements. She certainly is much more visible, much more vocal, much more assertive than any other North Korean official. We're not sure the level of input she has on policy, whether she is the real policymaker or the strong advisor to her brother, or whether she's carrying out her brother's wishes. We don't really know, but certainly she is much more bold and assertive than any other North Korean leader has been, because she has the power base from the family ties. So she has seemingly at times been the pit bull or the bad cop role. Sort of, I would advise very strong measures, however my brother might have different views. And so there's sort of with a good cop, bad cop, you try to hope that the good cop will be more benevolent. Other times she switched the role, where she's sort of intimated that her brother wanted a tough policy, but she was trying to have a more benign policy. So again, I think it's trying to divide our allies. We're trying to appeal to certain countries where they might say, well, if we could just offer more concessions, then maybe North Korea will do what we want. So we don't know the level of her policy making, but it certainly is much stronger than any other leader.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Lee, does Kim Yo-jong play a role in North Korea's navigation between great powers of United States, China, and Russia? And Kim Jong-un's reliance on his younger sisters, does that show his doubts and paranoia and his narrow pool of people that he can use?
No, I think it's more Kim Jong-un's recognition that his sister is entirely dependable and extremely capable. When I see the dynamics in body language in North Korean videos between the two siblings, it's extraordinary. At formal events like summit meetings, both take still glimpses of each other throughout the day and sort of nod and smile. And one of the formal charges made against their uncle back in December 2013, Chang Sung-taek, before having him executed, was not only treason and womanizing, but also, quote, half-heartedly clapping, end quote, half-heartedly clapping after Kim Jong-un's speech. Well, I've watched with some exaggeration, maybe over 100 hours of North Korean video in writing my humble book. Sometimes Kim Yo-jong doesn't clap at all after her brother's speech, while everyone else in the room, whether it's 500 or 5,000, are applauding, very enthusiastically. Sometimes she claps like this, and sometimes she has her arms completely down. And that speaks to her real position, her real power within the hierarchy. And I think she is very capable and smart. Several people who've met her have said so, that she was a very good student when they lived as young kids in Switzerland in the second half of the 1990s, whereas Kim Jong-un was not. So I see Kim Jong-un having complete trust for his sister and depending on her for advice. And Kim Yo-jong has issued many statements. One was in late January 2023, when she made her nation's first position, stated her nation's first position on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and declared that we will forever stand in the same trenches with the heroic people and army of Russia. And then North Korea reached out to Putin, effecting a summit meeting in September that year. So she's a real policymaker, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, we'll need to keep our eye on her statements and her decisions that she make. Dr. Lee, Mr. Klingner, thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having us.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.